Okay, so I'm going to start the recording. Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. We have here Magnus Vinding, who is the author of Suffering-Focused Ethics, and that's a book some of us at EA Melbourne have been reading for the past few weeks as part of our book club. He's also the author of many other books, including Reasoned Politics, Effective Altruism, How We Can Best Help Others, just to name a few. And he's also the co-founder of the Center for Reducing Suffering. So the way this session is going to go is, so Magnus and I are going to have a chat for a little bit, so around 30 to 40 minutes. And then, so while we're talking, I encourage all of you to ask any questions you have in the Q&A window. So not the chat window, but there should be a Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar or whatever you call it. Yeah, so in that window, you can also upvote questions asked by others. So if you do like a question, do upvote that. Because at the end, when I go down the list of questions, I will prioritize the most upvoted questions. Yeah, so if your question is called out, you will have the opportunity to ask Magnus the question yourself. And yeah, I think that's about it. So I will mute you all before proceeding. And by any chance, if it does go unmuted, please mute yourself back just so it goes, the session goes smoothly. Cool. Okay, welcome, Magnus. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me.
Yeah, of course. So I guess I think most of us, or a lot of us here, have read your book, Suffering-Focused Ethics. But for those of us who haven't, what would be your elevator pitch for what makes an ethical view suffering-focused?
Yeah, I mean, so as a matter of definition, yeah, I don't think there's like a sharp line defining when a view is suffering-focused or not. But yeah, generally speaking, it's a matter of whether a view gives, you can say, prominent or special priority to the reduction of suffering. So that there's a broad family of ethical views that have that feature in common, that they give a lot of importance to the reduction of suffering. So that can that's like it's a broad range, including, for example, consequentialist views, where one can be, say, what's sometimes called a negative leaning utilitarian, where you give sort of more weight to the reduction of suffering, or a pure negative utilitarian, where it's strictly only suffering, or it can also be frustrated preferences that you try to minimize. And then there are also other views that are not purely consequentialist, like, for example, views that say it's really important to reduce suffering as far as welfare is concerned, but you might also couple that with, say, certain rights that protect the autonomy and life of individuals. So there's like this very, very broad class of views that have a strong focus on the reduction of suffering in common.
Okay, cool. So I think most of us have heard of the term negative utilitarianism. And in your experience, how often is that confused with suffering-focused ethics? And is there overlap? Is there like, does one fall under the other? How do you think about it?
Right. Yeah. So unfortunately, that is a pretty common confusion in my experience. But yeah, so definitely negative utilitarianism is like it's a type of suffering-focused moral view, but it's like by no means the only one. So it's actually quite, because a very small subset, right? Because negative utilitarianism is just one subset. I mean, already consequentialism can be suffering-focused consequentialism is like a subset of suffering-focused views, and then within the subset of suffering or suffering-focused consequentialist views, you then find negative utilitarianism, which is already so it's sort of like a subset within a subset within a subset even. So it's kind of a very narrow sliver of this broader range of views. Um, yeah, and of course, in terms of what they have in common, it's like a strong focus on suffering, and that's, yeah, in some sense almost the only thing, right? Because that is like the one thing that, well, at least certain versions of negative utilitarianism will be, yeah, focusing on.
Yeah. And would you identify as a negative utilitarian then?
Yeah, so that's actually a little bit complicated. So I've actually more recently published an essay. It's called A Gödelist Argument Against Being a Pure Consequentialist, where, well, as the title hints, I argue against being a pure consequentialist. So that also means that uh, I'm not, I wouldn't call myself a negative utilitarian, but it's, uh, as I actually also write a bit about in that essay, I would say it's fair to call me like a quasi-consequentialist and a quasi-negative utilitarian. And some of, like in brief, part of the problem as I see it is that you can actually end up with a kind of uh, overly dogmatic position if you sort of, yeah, you lock your view into a, a specific view that you have of say, maybe not just ethics, but even all normativity in general, and then you evaluate everything by that standard. If you do that, you have a bit of a problem whereby how can you even question your own view, which to my mind just seems overly dogmatic. Um, that's not to say then that one can't say have even a high level of confidence in a given moral view, but just that it is sort of, it's not kind of 100% pure dogmatic thing. It's, my view is that, yeah, it makes sense to also, in at least in principle, you have room for actually doubting your own views, and you don't evaluate everything strictly by a particular conception of a moral view you currently have. So yeah, that's sort of the brief version. But to a first approximation, it's fair to say that, yeah, I have like a negative utilitarian.
Yeah. Um, so I guess that sounds like for any moral view that anyone adopts, it's probably healthier for there to be room for uncertainty, or like for them to acknowledge that there is room for uncertainty, and not just that it not just applies to consequentialist views, would you say?
Yeah, I think that's correct. And in fact, the argument that I make in that essay I just mentioned, in fact, also I do try to expand it to like to actually like any moral view in general. Oh, I'm really sorry. I have to quickly go look attend to something at my door. Sorry about that.
No worries.
I'm sorry about that. It's just
No,
some
all
people
good.
who need to fix something on my apartment, but they can do it
Yeah,
later for you.
no worries.
Oh yeah, I was just saying that, yeah, I do think that that point actually applies more generally, and I also think it's actually kind of there are even different levels at which I think the point applies. There's also um, yeah, that, so I think it's sort of pretty uncontroversial that when it comes to our basic ontological views, we ought to have a lot of uncertainty. There's just a lot we don't know about like basic ontology, and I think that uncertainty about ontology in general actually ultimately shades into a kind of moral uncertainty. I don't think that can quite be avoided because, like, the very terms that, I mean, it's those sort of are uh, the core building blocks of our moral views are ultimately derived from or come from like our views of ontology, right? So I don't see a way that you can really avoid that our uncertainty about purely descriptively like ontological issues also ultimately yeah, will result in some level of moral uncertainty. One example could be just like what kinds of value entities could even exist, right? That's something where, yeah, or even just like what kinds of entities could exist, and in turn, what kind of value entities would exist. But so, anyways, that's maybe a bit of an aside, but it's also, I don't know, maybe it's a sort of relevant note in terms of like general humility, which I do think is very warranted when it comes to how we think about ethics. And one last point I would want to stress in that regard is just that I do think that, although it can seem a bit contradictory, but that we can actually combine both um, like a strong humility with also then having a strong focus on reducing suffering. A bit like, I mean, an analogy might be we can have maybe a fairly high level of confidence that, say, in a given scientific hypothesis or observation, like say that the Earth is roughly spherical, but at the same time, we can also admit that we have just really deep uncertainty about like the nature of the world, and we are in principle open to at least, yeah, updating our views. So.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Um, in your so all of us here are part of the EA community. Um, how long, like, what's your involvement in EA? How much suffering focused discussions or views do you see in this community? Um, and yeah, what's your experience been in that?
Okay, so that's very interesting. I guess so. Two different questions. Like first, my own involvement. It's been a bit, yeah, bit of a long story. Like because I first became introduced to like ethics and utilitarianism, I guess you could say, through Sam Harris's book, The Moral Landscape, back in 2010. And I very much found that to be, I don't know, it kind of changed my whole outlook, actually, that book. But then, and I did, yeah, really kind of internalize that view, actually. It just made a lot of sense to me that, yeah, well-being really matters. And I could see that my own well-being clearly mattered. So, yeah, why not the well-being of everyone? Um, and then from that point, it actually was like, I think 3 years later, I encountered Peter Singer's talk about effective altruism. And I think that was the first time I encountered like the term effective altruism. I mean, of course, it was very in line with the ethical view I already held. And that also did actually make me, yeah, I think I immediately started donating also to some of the organizations he mentioned in that talk. Um, but then it was also a bit more, what can I say? It wasn't like I ever took a very deep dive or like joined the community as such. And I think one reason was maybe I remember also reading in 2015 the Effective Altruism Handbook, and I remember being quite, I mean, my perception, and I also came with, which actually happened a bit in the meantime, like I became very involved in like animal rights, and my view of effective altruism in general, like at the sort of mainstream level, was that it was pretty anthropocentric still. So that was for that reason I didn't sort of maybe resonate so much with the EA community at large, or at least yeah, was quite had some critiques of that. And then that maybe also relates then a bit to the second question about a focus on suffering, because I mean clearly the EA movement is it's very diverse, like in terms of cause areas that people prioritize, but also in terms of people's moral views. Um, and so, of course, there are a lot of people in EA who are very suffering focused, and I actually got, yeah, I got in touch with them. I guess, especially in 2016, I joined a conference in Berlin called the Sentience Conference, which was like a suffering focused EA conference. And then I did actually become more part of a community within EA, and also met at that conference actually the person I would eventually co-found CRS with later. But it was back in those days the German speaking EA community, was my impression, actually sort of originating from the Swiss one, was very suffering focused, I think. Um, and like these were the people who started also what is now the Center on Long-Term Risk, used to be called Foundation Research Institute, like together with Brian Tomasic from the US. And so these people have been, I guess, were pretty much the core of the software focused DA movement for a long time. But at the same time, it's also, I guess my impression is that a strong focus on suffering uh, to an extent that would sort of be called suffering focused. I don't think that is quite mainstream EA. Um, it's like perhaps one could say it's like a considerable chunk of the EA
Mm.
movement, but and maybe especially when it comes to the cause of animal rights and sometimes called animal welfare also. I guess that the focus on suffering tends to be strongly there. Um, and then when it comes to the long-term future, it's perhaps the least prominent. I'm not sure, but that I can have that impression. So in short, it's like a bit mixed and certainly present, but not like mainstream. I would say.
Yeah, great. You just answered what the next question I was going to ask you was which was do you see like clusters of ethical views across different cause areas? Like, do you see an ethical view is more prevalent in like in a cause area like AI safety versus a cause area like animal welfare or rights, versus long term, or S risk versus X risks? Um, yeah, is there anything more you want to say? Like, I guess you kind of answered, you did mention that in in the animal advocacy movement, that is like the suffering focused view is more prevalent than maybe other cause areas. But what about like when comparing long-term futures to the long-termism, to
Yeah,
not
yeah.
to non-long-termism?
Oh yeah, that's interesting. Um, I mean, it would actually be really interesting if there were better survey data looking sort of more directly at that. Mm, I mean, certainly suffering-focused views are represented across all cost areas, right? So there are people, including like people involved at yeah the organization where I work, Center for Reducing Suffering, and also at CLR, Center on Long-Term Risk, who are focusing on yeah long-term reducing suffering in the long-term future. But yeah, if one looks at like all people involved in yeah broadly speaking long-termism versus all people who are in EA who are focusing on shorter term, I guess I have the impression that probably a focus on suffering and perhaps also I don't know, maybe more sort of common sense values, for lack of a better term, probably more common in yeah, sort of more near-termist work.
Mm.
Whereas probably, I mean, I guess a view like classical utilitarianism, for example, or something similar to that, tends to be fairly common among people working on long-termist causes. Maybe especially actually if you compare to, say, academic moral philosophers, where I think those kinds of views are like quite a minority position, actually, is my impression.
Mm. Yeah.
I mean, there are
Um,
surveys on that also. One can look.
yeah. Yeah, it would be interesting to see that survey. Also, like I also wonder, I'm not expecting you to answer or speak to this, but I also wonder how how many people in within EA kind of have actually interrogated their own ethical views rather than just going with like deferring their ethical view to, oh, this is, someone else is doing something I think would be impactful. So I'm going to do it as well. Versus actually kind of interrogating your own view. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Okay.
mean, I certainly think, just to speak briefly to it, that there is a
Yeah.
lot of value in reflecting on one's moral views and outlooks, because it can be yeah, maybe for a couple of reasons, right? One is just that it can really change your priorities to a surprising degree. Right, so your priorities ultimately will be dependent on your underlying moral values. So it really is sort of the place to start, right? You want to ultimately start from values and then perhaps move to a cause area and then to some kind of intervention. Of course, there can also be interventions that are robust relative to many different kinds of values, which might speak in their favor.
Mhm.
But then another reason you might want to reflect is that it actually, perhaps contrary to how things are often presented, there's actually a surprising amount of disagreement, right? Um, and these kinds of views can really, yeah, the kinds of views that people are debating and considering, they differ by quite a lot, right? They can have almost opposite implications in terms of, for example, yeah, when it comes to population ethics, say, right, whether you want to just really increase future populations versus whether that's not a priority. So, yeah.
Yeah. Um, let's see. So, I came across recently an article written by you that was critiquing Toby Ord, who is obviously a very key figure in the EA movement. He wrote an article explaining why he's not a negative utilitarian. And then you had a very long critique of that essay. What would you, I mean, obviously both of you care deeply about reducing suffering, but there's obviously some very key differences between your philosophical underpinnings. What are some of the most important differences you would want to highlight between yours and his
Yeah,
views?
I think the key one is really actually the one that he places at the center of, like, at the beginning of his essay, which is this question of whether there is moral symmetry between suffering and happiness or not, right? So that would be, I think, the main difference, namely that he would say that it could be, I mean, to phrase it in one way, it could be, say, worthwhile or overall a better outcome if we add extreme suffering to an outcome, if we also add a sufficient amount of happiness. So to sort of compensate for or make up for that suffering, right? And I think that would be sort of the critical point of disagreement, would be that notion of, I don't accept that kind of compensation or offsetting, right? I don't find that to be a plausible view, that you can compensate for or outweigh, for example, extreme suffering or vast amounts of extreme suffering by adding a sufficient amount of happiness, right? And that's like one of those key differences that I just mentioned, that whether one accepts that or not, it can really, yeah, it matters greatly in terms of one's priorities. And yeah, I personally would like to see sort of more uh, discussion around that question, or at the very least, right, that it's actually, that people are made aware that, okay, this is actually really a key question to consider in the first place.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, what, so, EA typically has, we talk a lot about scale, neglectedness, and tractability. In your, so within suffering focused ethics, in your book, at least, you've talked a lot about really prioritizing extreme suffering, like extreme intensities of suffering. So when we talk about scale in the STN framework within EA, do you think we sometimes miss the intensity aspect of suffering there, and we're just more focused on scale. So there's a couple examples I can give you. So one is, for example, we talk a lot about farmed animals. So there's obviously a lot of suffering there, and scale is huge. Versus say something like lab animals, where relatively a lot lower in scale, but you could argue that their lives are maybe even they're going through extreme intensities of suffering. So that's kind of like we don't, in EA circles, we don't really, or effective animal advocates, we don't really talk about lab animals. We always mainly talk about farmed animals or wild animals. So that's one aspect where I think, tying that together with suffering focused, or um, in your book you mentioned principle of empathy for intense suffering. How would you tie that into this STN framework? Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, the principle of sympathy for intense suffering, that was, yeah, said before. Um, yeah, there is a lot to say, right? It actually, also, you could say it might be worth taking like a step back and looking at it. I mean, it's a kind of theoretical assumption, right, or question also, um, whether at the level of when it comes to value theory, do we model suffering as and its badness, or do we model that as a cardinal quantity, such that you have 10 instances of one suffering, so to use like some imaginary units, equals one instance of a 10 badness suffering or something like that, right? So, and there is a lot of literature discussing, well, actually discussing many aspects of these questions, right? So first of all, can we measure things even in principle? Does that make sense? And then there's the question of, yeah, how to value these different um kinds of experiences. And so there are some people who hold what's called an Archimedean view, according to which you can always uh, make an exchange, say, like no matter what kind of intensity of suffering. So less intense suffering can be worse than that if you have a sufficient number of instances, right? And then there are other people, including myself, who are more sympathetic to what is called, sometimes called lexical views, whereby, according to which um, you can always do make that kind of exchange. That, for example, a small, like a small pinprick, having that, no matter how many times you have that, it would never be worse than some a single experience of extreme suffering. And I think this is actually like it's a fairly thorny and difficult issue, and I think it's something where, yeah, I wouldn't want to like dismiss the complexity of that. But I do actually think that mm, people who hold, even people who sort of agree on these views, can often come to a kind of consensus that, yeah, generally, even if you think that, um, yeah, a very large number of mild instances of suffering can be worse, you might still agree that actually, yes, so in practice, we really generally do want to focus more on extreme suffering than we tend to do. Because, so for example, you could think that it's most plausible that it takes a huge amount of mild instances of suffering in order for it to be worse, right? So there are some who, for example, would argue for something like an exponential function of the badness as sort of intensity increases. I mean, of course, which has like its own kinds of problems, but yeah, in terms of offshots, practical offshots, I do think that generally we that there are strong reasons to take extreme suffering much more seriously than we tend to do. And I would even also say that I think plausibly there are yeah, some biases that may hold us back from thinking about this, because the more intense and severe suffering gets, I mean, the more unpleasant can it also be to really think about it, right? We can have this, yeah, natural tendency to shy away from it, and even to begin, to sit down and then do these kinds of calculations. It can be, or if calculations is the right word, right? Weighing these different kinds of considerations, also broadly speaking, it can be tough work. And I mean, if we to turn it back to this more concrete case of what about lab animals and farm animals, I think it's not so clear to me that it applies so straightforwardly, or like that it, at least that it favors more work on lab animals. I mean, I think that could be the case, but I mean, there is then the question of how much extreme suffering actually occurs in animal farming and how much occurs among lab animals. And unfortunately, I think the picture also does look really, really bad for farmed animals in terms of like extreme suffering occurring in slaughterhouses and also in factory farms and so on. And similarly, I guess many lab animals are probably spared from extreme suffering, sort of live fairly, I don't know, yeah, of course, lives of confinement that I would say are not, certainly other things equal, worth bringing to the world for their own sakes. But like whether, yeah, so that's just to say it's a really complicated question, and ultimately there is also a bias that's worth being aware of called, I mean, sometimes referred to as proportion dominance. So where we can have this tendency to, like, yeah, a brief way to put it is like we would rather help 9 out of 10 than help, say, 10 out of 100, right? But arguably, it's like the ultimate, uh, yeah, the ultimate net amount of help that actually matters, right? So even if the proportion of animals who suffer intensely is much higher among lab animals, we might nevertheless, I mean, again, given our limited resources, we might still be able to help more beings who experience intense suffering among farmed animals, because there are, I would estimate like a much higher number of beings who experience intense suffering in, yeah, in that domain.
Yep. And also another thing that I've been thinking about is this, Rethink Priorities recently, or like a few years ago, they published a EA forum post on welfare ranges, so across different species, and it was a first pass at it. Wasn't refined or polished or anything like that. And by welfare range, I mean the ability for a type of species um, to have like what kind of the intensity of experience they can have, so valenced experience they can have. Um, what so if you have if you're concerned with alleviating extreme forms of suffering, does that then simply then transfer to prioritizing species with a higher welfare range? So by higher welfare range, I mean their ability, so species with the ability to have um, more extreme forms of experiences, both positive and negative, which means they can also suffer a lot more intensely than other species, like, say, mammals versus, oh, let's say, humans versus earthworms, for example.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that's actually a case where, I mean, so there are a few things to say, right? So first of all, um, it's probably worth noting that the talk of welfare ranges in the first place, and how precisely to think of that, is kind of, could you say, like a sort of disputed matter, right? Because there is some, again, this question of whether you think about these states in terms of as cardinal quantities versus not. That's already like a relevant foundational question. And then I think that even if you, I think a relevant point is that even if you think that the welfare ranges of say worms, or like for example their capacity to experience suffering is very limited by your best estimate, I think there's actually still then a relevant level of uncertainty that in fact becomes relevant in your if one does some kind of expected value reasoning, right? That's not to say that one should adopt the most naive form of that, but I think some version of expected value reasoning can still help at least inform our priorities, right? And I do think, like for example, to say when it comes to nematodes, right, and they are very, very abundant in number, um, but we say we estimate that they are very unlikely to experience intense suffering. We assign a very, very low probability to that. Um, Nevertheless, I do think that, uh, yeah, in terms of our like overall final estimates of, say, how much, how many instances of intense suffering we think there are there in expectation, I think it can actually ultimately move us, right? Even if we estimate them to be, yeah, quite unlikely to experience intense suffering. I mean, that doesn't necessarily give you like a clean um, answer, but it does at least give us reason to be a bit cautious about, which by the way can also be kind of suspiciously convenient, right? To say, oh, but I think that we're unlikely to experience intense suffering. Let me just completely ignore that. So,
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, okay, I'm just wondering if I should open up the floor to questions. So, okay, maybe I'll ask you one last question, and then in the meantime, for the audience, please have your questions ready. In a few minutes, you'll get to ask them. Okay, so I guess on more practical sort of question, um, have you had like a real decision that you've made where your suffering focused uh, ethics or views clearly guided that choice over making some other choice?
oh, I mean, almost like every choice, but no, but yeah, I mean, yeah, I
I guess
certainly,
during the transition of when, like, I guess another question I could ask you is, when did you always have a suffering focused view, and what changed if you haven't had that always?
right.
What caused that transition? Maybe
Yeah,
answer
yeah,
that
that, no,
first. Yeah.
yeah, it's a great question, and actually. The answer is that no, I didn't always have that focus. So as I mentioned early on, I was very inspired by Sam Harris's framework in the moral landscape, and he, I mean, quite implicitly, but he has like sort of a classical utilitarian symmetric view, and I pretty much endorsed that, and actually kind of derived the importance of space colonization from that. So I really fully bought into that kind of view. And then I think my view then gradually changed because, like, so one big influence, huge influence for me was David Pearce, so whom I'm sure many of you know. I encountered his work in 2013, in fact, around the same time where I found, yeah, Peter Singer's talk on EA. And so what stood out to me was that so David clearly has a very strong focus on reducing suffering, and he's a self-identified negative utilitarian. And so I guess the kinds of things that he wrote about that, well, it gave me pause and made me reflect a lot, I think. So I didn't right away by any means like share his view, but I did. I mean, of course, I mean, I guess all utilitarians in the first place agree that obviously it's important to reduce suffering. But yeah, I mean, so the degree to which I would give priority, I mean, I think it took maybe around 2 years or so of like very gradual reflection and updates until I then, yeah, became more clearly like strongly suffering focused. Yeah, and that was maybe yeah, I think around actually 2015 actually. Like there was one particular, there was actually like a thought experiment that I encountered about. Uh, I guess it was something like a girl being stuck under a truck and who was burning alive and then the sort of very pointed but relevant question of this: can any happiness outweigh that, right? And that was something that really, I don't know, it was like that almost like that was the first time I finally really asked myself that question, or question an assumption that I had otherwise sort of taken very much for granted. Um, yeah, so yeah, that was kind of the evolution in short, I guess.
Hmm. How long after did you write the book, Suffering Focused Ethics?
Yeah, so the book was published in, I think, late May 2020, so roughly 5 years after that. Um,
Mm.
and and so actually, I had written a book about ethics, in fact, the year prior, where that was, and I think the view I defended there was a bit like a, yeah, like a kind of negative leaning utilitarianism. Um, so yeah, like this very gradual uh, development of my view.
Mhm. Awesome. Okay, I'll take a pause with my questions and open up the floor to the audience. So we have 4 questions of 5 questions at the moment. None of them, as far as I can see, have been upvoted. So we'll just go down chronologically. Michael, do you want to ask your question?
Oh, unmute. There we go. Start video as well, so you can see my face while I ask the question. So, hello, Magnus. Thank you for coming along. So, my question is kind of just do you have any thoughts, or can we expect any thoughts on kind of the Forethought Institute and McCaskill's recent pivot to more explicitly be focusing on kind of like capturing upside rather than managing downsides and risks? Because my perception is that, at least until recently, he was more interested in existential risk and potentially also suffering focus in kind of making sure that futures aren't bad. But my sense is that he's gone more for we want futures to be as good as possible, maybe at the cost, I don't know, but maybe they're not so worried about how much suffering there is if they're going to be really, really good. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts or reactions on that yet.
Yeah, great question. I mean, I have noticed it and been honestly a bit surprised by it, but I do want to say, let's see. So I think given certain assumptions, it can actually make a lot of sense. So if you have like a sort of pretty sort of standard classical utilitarian view, and you then combine that with like the view that a strong upsides focus, like strong priority on upsides is very, very neglected, then I can see how it could actually make strategic sense to go in that direction. I mean, of course, where I differ is that I like reject that first premise, or yeah, disagree strongly with that. And my impression was also, I mean, I'm a bit unsure, maybe so also in some of his work on moral uncertainty, I think McGaskill has maybe argued for sort of a slightly weak, stronger focus on suffering, but I think overall it maybe is like quite weak and still fairly close to kind of symmetry view. Um, so yeah, I mean, I guess those are my thoughts. Obviously, it's not the focus or priority that I agree with.
Okay, cool. Next question by Adam.
Hey, thanks for joining us, Magnus. So, yeah, as we discussed before the event, yes, you confirm as a moral realist, so there should be features or logical truths that are discoverable about, hedonic valence and what would count as good. So what would you say would be, I mean, if we could get AI to help us with this, that would be amazing. But what empirical research can be done to further ground our views on making hedonic trade-offs and positioning lexical thresholds such that the landscape of value, or the moral landscape, can be made more clear? How can we design these experiments to either confirm, increase our confidence intervals, or falsify our existing assumptions and generate better ones?
Oh yeah, really. Thanks, Adam. That's a good question, and I might give a very annoying answer actually. Um, Like, because mm, so there is then a related question of to what extent is such research ethical, right? And there you might think it's unethical, or at least maybe not a priority for a variety of reasons. I mean, so one reason, and probably the one that, say, an ethics board would take issue with, is, for example, if you had to subject someone to very extreme forms of suffering in order to probe some kind of threshold that might not get approval, right? Like it's just and even like from a very like hard-nosed consequentialist perspective, it yeah, I'm not sure it would get approval there either, right? Because there are also questions about and that's sort of more like on the methodological side, that I'm also not actually sure about yeah, the ultimate tractability of getting particularly crisp answers to that kind of question. Like yeah, so even if we set all ethical considerations aside, which of course is like your actual question, um, yeah, I mean, I think the short answer to that is that I genuinely don't know. I mean, we can sort of imagine some kind of idealized setting, right, where we have people they're super well trained in introspection, um, and maybe also being very, very informed about a whole big philosophical literature about yeah, like philosophy of well-being and also value theory. And then in principle, we would be free to subject them, and they would be maybe welcoming or maybe not, to be subjected to virtually any kind of experience. Um, even in that, even under such idealized conditions, I suspect it might be kind of, I mean, obviously we could improve a lot on what we currently know, and it could be, again, setting ethical issues aside, it could be relevant, very relevant data. But I don't know how much it would actually necessarily move us compared to already, yeah, a stance where you might already sort of have, in simple terms, a focus on reducing extreme suffering. And here I mean like at the level of actual like practical priorities, how much would it change if we could get such information? And so I mean that's maybe a long-winded way to say that maybe I see it as somewhat limited intractability, especially when we add real-world constraints. And then I sort of briefly mentioned one kind of ethical reservation one could have, but I think another relevant one that goes yeah beyond the one I mentioned is that it might actually be very risky to know more about this because and this is admittedly speculative, but it could be that by gaining more knowledge about these things, you could actually enable people to create suffering, right? And so that might not be, or at least it's kind of unclear whether that's worthwhile to take that kind of risk, especially like when we consider, yeah, like maybe other priorities one could have instead. I know that's sort of very like not a satisfying reply, but yeah, I think those are kind of relevant considerations in that context. I've written a kind of a relevant essay that's called "Why I Don't Prioritize Consciousness Research," which gets at yeah like some of these same reasons, and that's actually despite in the past, I used to think that that was a very strong priority and even strongly argued for that in the first version of the book I wrote on effective altruism. So yeah, that's been one of the things I've changed my mind on in like a big way.
Okay, thanks. I could go on, but I think I might leave it up to the rest of the crew to ask their questions.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks again.
so I think Daniel is up next with the first question you asked.
Yeah, hi Magnus. Thanks again for joining. Yeah, you've mentioned a couple instances so far where you've changed your views on things, but I was wondering if you could go into like a bit more detail about the range of things you've changed your your views about both like philosophical and more empirical views about what we should do and what we should focus our resources on, like what you've just talked about with consciousness research.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Daniel. I don't know if I can even quite do it justice, right? I mean, I guess as a very general remark, it I feel a bit like the changes and like refinements in one's views over time. It almost feels a little bit like at an earlier stage, maybe I was kind of building with Duplo Legos, and then I got kind of transition more to the smaller ones, and it's a bit more, yeah, it's just maybe more nuances, more complexity in a certain sense, right? Like for example, um, starting out, like again, broadly speaking, but like starting out having these sort of relatively firm pieces, and like so there are these causes, and it's sort of clearly helpful to push on those, um, and then over time, I guess you come to more. I've come to see many more. Like there can be potential conflicts between, say, different cause areas, and also, um, like yeah, like relevant, like trade-offs that are perhaps sharper and stronger than we tend to acknowledge at first. Um, and just yeah, so it's like almost you can start off with sort of like a very simple picture, and then it clearly or sorry quickly develops to a place where it's like there's just so many interrelated threads, right? So it's just like empirically, mm, things can tend to be a lot more uh, unclear over time, right? And I guess so. I guess many people, right? And it's a common experience within EA that you eventually confront empirical uncertainty as a big thing, right? And it's something that really, yeah, it can leave you almost paralyzed, right? There's this related term of analysis paralysis, and I think that's just something that's uh, very real and in some form at least insurmountable, right? That it's just always gonna be there, and of course there are then different discussions on how you approach that, right? So some people defend the cluelessness view, and they then explore different options to deal with that. And I guess my own view, actually, that's interestingly enough an area where I don't know if I've changed my view that much, because I've for a very long time seen empirical uncertainty as being just like huge. I mean, I guess it was even chapter 9, right? In software focused ethics, uncertainty is big. Um, but of course, yeah, how one approaches that. I mean, shifting away from the like more purely empirical stuff, I guess my own view has also like more on the side of like moral principles and the like. I guess I have probably become a bit more like functionally pluralist also in terms of how, like, because one way to approach ethical problems, right, if you're a consequentialist utilitarian, is that you just see the problem and you sort of straightforwardly ask, okay, so then what has the best consequences? Like what best helps to reduce suffering here? And I think, many academic moral philosophers, it's just not how they approach questions. And I think, which I would use to sort of scoff at, and that's silly, but I think they're actually kind of right to approach things differently, right? In terms of, for example, okay, what seem to be like reasonable procedures or maybe rules or whatever considerations that are relevant in this case. And I think this effort to shoehorn everything into to cash it out in terms of consequences for welfare, it just yeah, often just isn't practical, and yeah, ironically often I think doesn't give you the best outcomes, which of course is kind of a familiar thing with the decision procedures versus criterion of rightness in consequentialism, and that those are different. But I think maybe a key point is that even the decision procedures you shouldn't necessarily expect to actually derive them from consequentialist considerations, that you can often, yeah, maybe common sense or something like that, or reflective common sense is maybe often better. I mean, but again, I mean, I said it's a bit of a difficult question to quite reply to honestly. But yeah, I guess those are some of the main things.
Awesome. Sandstone.
So my question was, are there degrees of unbearable suffering? I think you touched on this a bit in response to Adam's question. So perhaps it's related to something like ontological cluelessness. And I did see that you wrote a post this year on reducing suffering given long-term cluelessness. And well, there's like very repugnant conclusions on how you answer the initial question, if there are degrees of unbearable suffering.
Right. Yeah. So I think it's a great question. I mean, I think obviously, again, it can sort of, there are different ways to operationalize unbearable suffering, right, or define that. And one simple definition might be something like, well, a person might, first of all, say, oh, I can't bear this. One could also make it more, what could you say, push it further by saying there needs to be a certain price. Like, if you can't bear this anymore, then maybe something terrible happens, maybe to oneself in the future. Because in the first case, the first kind of definition might be someone might just say, okay, I can't bear this at a very mild stage, right? So, I mean, and that also gets at how it's a bit complicated, right? Because unbearable suffering, while it's kind of a simple term, it can also just like vary a lot across from person to person, actually, like how much they could bear if one defines it in that way of, yeah, now they have to say stop, right? But, and I think if one uses a kind of definition like that, I think it would be kind of clear that it does make sense to talk about different levels because even when the person first says, okay, now I can't, it's unbearable, even then it could most likely get worse and probably a lot worse, right? Especially if we start talking about like nasty stuff about creative torture methods and so on, and drugs that won't give people. So in short, yes, I think there are such, it makes sense to talk about such different levels. And then indeed, right, there are these very difficult questions about how to say which value to assign and how to compare the value of such different forms of suffering. I would say, I think those questions are interesting, but thankfully, I think I have doubts at least that it's super critical in terms of priorities. Because I could see how, yeah, I mean, there could be some divergences, obviously, depending on which kind of view you adopt on that kind of question. But I tend to think on most issues, they would actually converge rather strongly, right? Like, for example, whether you just think we should prioritize unbearable suffering, that almost regardless of how one prioritizes among different kinds of unbearable suffering or extreme suffering. Those kinds of views, I think if they agree on the first question that is a priority before other things, then I do think that in most cases they will tend to agree on in practice. But yeah, so beyond that, I mean, there are of course various like sort of at a formal level, like there are various approaches one can take. I have written an essay myself. What is it? This is on the Center for Reducing Suffering's website. There is one called lexicality between mild discomfort and unbearable suffering, a variety of possible views. And that's just a bit like kind of a review of how one can of different options of how one can approach that kind of question. I can actually share it here in chat. So I don't know if that quite answered your question.
All right. Next up, we have Callum.
Hi, Magnus. Thanks very much for
Hello.
taking the time to join us. So my question is, just wondering, what do you think about the possibility, and of course, been touching on uncertainty, but despite that, what do you think about the possibility of potentially reducing suffering by increasing pleasure? So perhaps to the extent that people who have more pleasure or are happier or whatever may be more capable of reducing suffering for others and those second order effects.
Yeah. So interestingly, a colleague of mine named Theo Taival, he has written a whole like essay collection called Minimalist Axiologies, and he dives into that quite a lot, and he actually emphasizes that yeah, in his view, it's an underappreciated point that views that center on the reduction of suffering or the minimization of other bads, that they can actually also value other things for instrumental reasons or due to the roles that they have, right? Beneficial roles. And I mean, I guess most consequentialists will consider this like an obvious point when it comes to, say, the value of knowledge, right? That even if you don't intrinsically value knowledge, it's still extremely important and valuable due to the beneficial effects. And similarly, yeah, even if one doesn't, say, value a certain experience by giving it yeah, intrinsic positive value, it could still actually have instrumental positive value. It's one of the points that yeah, Theo is stressing a lot in his writings, and I think it's I think it is an important point actually that and obviously it applies to so many things, right? And that's also one reason why yeah, one just generally has to be quite careful about construing consequentialist views too narrowly, right? That one actually, it's important to account for these other things, and it's not just a matter of you directly try to optimize for some, yeah, like some narrow quantity that's ultimately the one that you care about or care the most about, that you really actually want to have like a healthier and more sensible approach is that you really you build up a lot of resources where you could, this is again my colleague's framing actually, but one could think also similarly of well-being as being a kind of resource that is worth building, not just because it reduces your suffering, but actually can make you more effective change maker.
Okay. I think we have a question from Anonymous. So in the doom case where AI gets out of human control and takes over, where humans go extinct, do you have any thoughts or modeling around how that might affect the level of total suffering in the world or universe long term? And does that change based on whether these, I assume these AIs develop sentience or suffering themselves?
Yeah, that's a good question, and also one that is has in fact been explored quite a lot. I mean, at least like, more generally, this question of like what are like likely outcomes or the most concerning outcomes when it comes to the development of AI and how different scenarios could play out. I think there is some, well, again, to give a bit of a boring answer, but like there's a lot of uncertainty around it, and people have also been focusing on this from a perspective of, I mean, so those who are tend to approach long-term issues from a suffering-focused angle, they have generally, focused quite strongly on the reduction of S risks, that is, risks of astronomical future suffering. So, without being particularly committed to what's the most likely outcome, the focus, as far as priorities are concerned, has then been just to try to minimize the kinds of outcomes where things go very badly. I mean, I guess in terms of views of what's actually likely, I mean, I guess the whole S-risk community, I think, is, well, they have even sort of developed in that direction, but like, if not completely clueless, then sort of fairly clueless, like a lot of uncertainty. But yeah, as far as priorities are concerned, it's then been there has been a strong focus on trying to avoid worst case outcomes due to, for example, different AI systems ending up in a kind of conflict that could result in a lot of suffering. So that's been a huge focus in that area. So like and some of that is, what can I say? And even that is also then very difficult to actually think about, because what kinds of scenarios are most concerning, and how, even if you knew that, how would you go about preventing them? So, I mean, there are it's a lot of open questions and a lot of uncertainty, and indeed, I think it's these kinds of questions that actually have led a lot of people to endorse cluelessness in some form. So saying that we simply don't know, we simply can't know. So yeah, I don't know. That probably didn't address the question so much, other than, I mean, it's kind of an honest answer that it's a big unknown. And of course, one can then try to begin to sort of look at different kinds of scenarios that could occur, right? For example, you might have artificial sentience emerging, and then, which could emerge in very different ways, right? It could be that the AI systems themselves are not sentient, but they create some other systems that are sentient, or it could be that they are themselves sentient, and perhaps, or maybe some subset of AI systems are sentient and suffer a lot. And I mean, and those are the kinds of scenarios that some people have then tried to work on, and indeed there is some emerging work. I think the cause area of artificial sentience is sort of growing a bit currently, like the organization Sentient Futures, that has rebranded. Previously it was called AI for Animals. I think they're doing a course actually about artificial sentience, so maybe it's worth, if one is interested, one can maybe try to look into that.
Cool. Back to Michael with your next question.
Just kind of just like a nice, fun, well, maybe not fun one, I suppose, up to you. But if you weren't working on suffering-focused ethics, if you were instead, for whatever reason, like maybe we solve this and everybody agrees on it, what do you think you would be working on instead?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, okay, yeah. I don't know. I might actually be, I might study science or something. Like, I find anthropology and evolutionary psychology to be very interesting fields. So maybe something like that. I'm not sure if it's not altruistic. But then, in terms of altruistic priorities, if it weren't for suffering, I mean, then there's sort of a question about whether there are other harms beyond suffering. I don't know if you want to set those aside, but like, I think that at least would be actually my next priority if we say that suffering was solved. Yeah.
Let's see. Back to Daniel with your next question.
Sure. So yeah, currently you're finishing up your next book, Compassionate Purpose, which is, as I understand, like aimed towards helping people pursue altruistic purposes, especially reducing extreme suffering in healthy ways. And yeah, if you want to talk to that more generally, you can. But I was also specifically interested in, there's a footnote somewhere in the book, Suffering Focused Ethics, where you mentioned this like video of Brian Tomasik's like trying to persuade people to care about extreme suffering. And you mentioned that like people have been severely traumatized by that video. And I'm wondering like how you think about exposing people to extreme suffering in a way that's persuasive and convinces them to take it seriously while not turning them away from the issue or just traumatizing them.
Yeah. Thanks. That's a super good question, and honestly, also something that, to be perfectly honest, I think I've had a bit of a blind spot around this personally. Like, I think also even considering the question of whether I I have experienced some trauma myself in engaging with this, which I think I've been very reluctant to think in those terms because I think I kind of confused it for a kind of self-victimization. And it was in fact based on some feedback I got from someone who had a look at my book. His main suggestion was looking into something related to trauma, actually, which I found, yeah, to be a very interesting suggestion. And actually, based on that, I'm tentatively planning to add a section on that very thing of trauma. And I know your question is a bit more sort of forward directed, but even like for those who are already engaged, or have this kind of priority, I think it might be valuable to actually explore that angle more. Um, but yeah, then how do you communicate, and how does one uh, strike a good balance there? I mean, I think it's ultimately it's good to try to inform people, um, like to make a kind of disclosure maybe beforehand. Um, I also think, to be honest, I mean, you can say it's a kind of case of, yeah, like you really are trying to balance, right? Because you don't want to make people, other things equal, you don't want to cause people a lot of distress and misery and even trauma. Um, and you also don't want to obviously incapacitate people such that they is just sort of left in a helpless state where just a state of overwhelm, which is in fact like a big part of what I try to do in my book. This shift from being, is one key component, right, of being stuck in a kind of empathic distress where you share the experience of the other versus shifting more into a kind of compassion that is at least like less bothered, less sharing the state, where it's like a desire to reduce their suffering, but it's not a sharing in their suffering, at least as strongly as directly. So I think that's a key component that's a key part of the answer, I think, to this conundrum, is to shift more in that direction. And maybe that's actually kind of a first step to take before moving toward exposure. Um, that's actually a thought I've been having when writing this book. This is maybe I've done things in the wrong order, because maybe this psychological preparation stuff is actually more the place to start versus, yeah, just diving right deep into the deep end, right? So yeah, I think that kind of aspect is really important. What I wanted, I didn't quite finish my thought about the trade-offs um, that yeah, of course, you don't want to cause people to suffer then, but at the same time, it's also true that there are these realities out there, right? And it's not, and we arguably have some kind of, we have a strong reason to be informed, right? When we make up our minds about our priorities. So I think we have to, yeah, in some way also keep the full picture in view, and acknowledge that like the reality is, right, that we as humans, we have, by virtue of our abilities, capacities, and power, frankly, that we have a lot of responsibility there, and our decisions, they really matter, are hugely consequential, right? And for that reason, that we also do need to um, I think it is in some sense incumbent on us to be informed, even about things that are very very painful. So, but yeah, like shifting more in the direction of compassion over empathic distress, I think is a really a key part, and maybe should be emphasized more strongly. And then perhaps being more informed about trauma related stuff, which, as mentioned, I've just sort of opened that door myself recently.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think that's probably it for audience questions. Thanks, Magnus, for patiently going through those questions. I guess before we wrap up, I want to ask you, what is one concrete project or organization that you think is missing and that you wish exists in the suffering focus space?
Wow, yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, so there has recently been a bit more of a shift at where I work, but I mean, I think it could be interesting. I don't know how concrete this is, but like actually something that's a bit more community focused, maybe. I think this because so far so much of the work, the projects, the organizations, they have been very you could say intellectual and research oriented, and yeah, I think there is room for not just stuff that prioritizes psychological health, but also something that's more kind of community oriented. I mean, interestingly, one colleague of mine also expressed some reservations about the community angle, but it does seem to me kind of neglected, right? Because you can find like EA focused communities, but I think they are not necessarily so strongly focused on suffering and the challenges that are kind of maybe particular to suffering. So yeah, I guess something related to building healthy communities could be something that
Out of curiosity, what did your friend have reservations about building community around this?
Yeah, so it was not so super specific, but a bit like more that questioning whether community was something that was so desirable to have. I mean, I can think of some reasons, right? You might think perhaps you could end up perhaps having too much uniformity in terms of views. There might be one concern. You might also think that perhaps it's healthy to have. I mean, of course, that's then just sort of a matter of how much does the community define one's identity, right? But at least it can also be healthy to have a life outside of that kind of thing. So, but I don't know exactly like the details of this person's view.
Yeah, fair enough. What are you working on these days? And is there anything you'd like to tell us about that?
Yeah, so what I'm working on is actually what Daniel just mentioned. This book, Compassionate Purpose, Personal Inspiration for a Better World. And it is very much, I mean, it's in this spirit of the suffering focused ethics, which was very much about like sort of general ethics, almost like phrased in third person terms. And then I wrote this book, Recent Politics, which is sort of about the political collective level. And then this current book, Compassionate Purpose, is more than at the personal level. It's almost like a self-help book, but based on like essentially suffering-focused values, so like grounded strongly in that. So sort of it rests on, in some sense, rests on my book, Suffering-Focused Ethics, as kind of as the foundation for that book. And then it's basically just exploring many different domains of personal development or personal optimization, like including even like habits and like sleep and diet and that kind of thing, but also these things I mentioned about how to relate to suffering obviously is a very big part of it. like both our own suffering and suffering out there in the world. And there's actually a lot of good news, thankfully, right? That there, like for example, it turns out that when it comes to burnout, that's something that, yeah, we might often think that, oh, burnout, that's mostly about, say, like you work too much or so, and that can surely be an important factor. But actually, the strongest predictor of burnout across different studies is low self-compassion or harsh self-criticism. So that at least is suggestive that that's an area where those who struggle with burnout could actually, maybe do much better. And in fact, there was also last year a book published even about this. I think it's called Self-Compassion for Burnout by Christine Neff and Chris Germer. So yeah, I guess that could be worth looking into for those struggling with burnout. But what I've generally found is that actually, when it comes to many of the issues that we tend to struggle with when we confront suffering, or more generally try to improve the world and might feel a lot of guilt or even shame around it, there are actually a lot of really helpful tools. So I've tried to collect a lot of those in my book, and I've also learned a lot myself in the process.
Yeah, that's great to hear. It's definitely like dealing with suffering is not dealing with others' suffering is not discussed enough, I think, in the movement. It's great to hear that you're working on that. Yeah, I think we will call it there. Thank you so much, Magnus, for joining us. And for everyone asking your questions to Magnus, I hope you enjoyed this conversation, this session. Yeah, we might actually do our next book club on compassionate purpose. Could be one of our next books.
Yeah, I hope to publish it sometimes within, I don't know, within a few months is my hope. But yeah.
Nice. We'll keep an eye out. Awesome. Thanks, Magnus. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much for
Have a
having
great
me.
evening.
Thanks for all your questions. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, take care, everyone.